Hi, I'm Catherine Jean Lopez from the National Review Institute, and I'm so delighted today to be joined by my friends from the Catholic Association, Maureen Ferguson, Ashley McGuire, and Lee Sneed. Thank you all for taking the time. Both our speakers, our women we'll be in conversation with, and for everyone who's watching live, joining us live, or are watching this after the fact on YouTube. And please feel free to share this as well. Obviously, Roe, the end of Roe, and the future of the pro-life movement and where we go from here is a hot topic. A lot of people are thinking about this. And so that's why on the 1 week anniversary of the end of Roe versus Wade, because of the Mississippi abortion case at the Supreme Court, I wanted to convene this so we can talk a little bit about where we are and where we need to be going. And we were talking amongst ourselves yesterday and thought a good way to sort of think about this conversation is to think of it in terms of faith, hope, and love, the virtues, those critical virtues, and faith. If we can start talking about, obviously religious faith, obviously life is a gift from the Creator, but you don't have to be religious to recognize that abortion is the killing of a developing child, an unborn child. And also, I think in terms of faith, of the pro-lifers who for 49 years have been working and praying, and so many people hidden on the front lines. Maureen, can you start us off in just talking about your insights over the last week?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I found, very obviously, we all had great joy over the decision, but also a lot of consternation over the violent attacks on the pregnancy centers and the attacks on the Supreme Court justices and protests at their home. Just a lot of upset. I feel like there's been, as Mary Eberstadt has written so beautifully, there's been this sort of primal scream of woundedness coming in the wake of the decision. So I was finding myself actually quite upset after the decision. And I ended up at Mass with this lovely Indian priest whose name is actually Father Joy. Joy is his given name. And it was the gospel reading of Jesus asleep in the boat when the storm was raging and the disciples are so upset, we are perishing. And Jesus, calms the storm. And the priest, Father Joy, asked all of us to give each other a smile of calmness and peace. And he had us look around at our, neighbor in the church and give everybody a smile of calmness and peace. And it was just sort of spot on for as so many pro-lifers have said, there's that Winston Churchill quote that we're really only at the end of the beginning because really our work is just beginning here. So I think having that attitude of calmness and peace and faith that Jesus has got this is important to keep in mind right now.
Thank you, Maureen. And I just wanted to mention to anyone watching live that you can feel free to put any questions in the chat box and I'll weave them into the conversation during the course of our hour. Ashley, and I should add that you have a book called Sex Scandal, The Drive to Abolish Male and Female, which in many ways is really at the heart of the abortion debate and getting to the root causes, if you will. What have been your predominant thoughts over the last week?
Well, I certainly echo what Maureen said, which I think has been interesting to see that it's been kind of a spontaneous but common refrain among pro-lifers, which is that this is just the beginning. And, we have been preparing for this moment for some people for most of their adult lives, and certainly for me, for my adult life. But I've been happy to see that the pro-life side has been, even though rightfully jubilant, not rubbing this in as some sort of victory, but instead having sort of a sobriety about, okay, now it's really time to get to work. And that work is sort of twofold. One is, working at the state level to, because what overturning Roe does is return this issue back to the state. So working at the state level to help put in place and solidify strong protections for women and babies, but also to do sort of the cultural work of, tilling the soil for creating a culture where, as people have said, abortion is unthinkable. So creating a culture where maternity and motherhood is respected. And one thing that strikes me from the other side was this rush of corporations tripping over themselves to say, "Oh, these are going to be our abortion benefits," and it's really like, "Oh, the masks are slipping off," and it shows that we don't have a very pro-maternal culture, because that's what they're rushing to do. Not, here's our paid leave benefit. Here's what we'll do to help you if you're a woman in crisis or you find yourself in a difficult pregnancy. Here's going to be our adoption benefits, whether it's you're choosing to place your baby for adoption and you need the time off, or you're stepping in to fill the void and adopt a baby. So it's obvious that there's so much work that we have to do. And just, you mentioned my book, so I'll say briefly that I think this, we sort of came to this moment because women were told, especially starting with the sexual revolution and second wave feminism, that equality with men means being like men. And that means making our bodies like men. And that means either sterilizing our bodies, treating our fertility like a sickness, and discarding our children if need be. And so, this is something that Erica Bakioki has really pioneered the thinking on this. And so, that also is part of our cultural work, which is, now we're at this crossroads. How do we step forward and create a culture where women are able to flourish and not afraid to flourish as their authentic bodily selves?
One thing I've been thinking a lot about the last couple of days is maybe we should call ourselves the pro-choicers, because it's amazing how many people who advocate for abortion insist on abortion as the answer to every problem. If maternal health is an issue, mortality is an issue, let's have more abortion. No, why don't we make circumstances better for minority women? It really is. There is as has been said already, the masks are off, so to speak. In a particular way, I'd like you to talk about the adoption option that Ashley just talked about. You have a newborn at home. So this issue, this historic moment must just be so, quite the moment for you. It's quite the moment for everyone. But when you have a newborn in your arms, that's
right. Especially one that came a couple of weeks early. And so, all those, definitely all the feels about those issues. But it really does, just like any sort of big cultural thing that happens after that initial rejoicing, you just start to sort of really reckon, like, you're just talking about making circumstances better. Well, how do I do that? We've been fighting it for so long and hoping and praying for this day. What do I do now? Is it enough? Is what I have been doing, do I keep doing that, like on a personal level, outside of my own children, but like giving to pregnancy resource centers and marching? Are we still marching for life? Do we still go to are we still doing that? What is it that we can do? And it's so vast, it's overwhelming. And especially when, even if you consider yourself a part-time activist or a supporter of pro-life charities, oftentimes real poverty and the real desperation of a crisis pregnancy isn't something that we come to, it doesn't affect our lives in that very personal way. So what is it like for those women who've been told that the answer to that problem is abortion, and now it's taken away from them, and they haven't grown up in the culture of life? They haven't, seen it. They haven't seen, the goodness that can come from adoption. They don't know, what are they feeling? And to really be compassionate right now, so that we don't, I mean, I don't know if it's not being any more polarized is even possible at this point, but keeping those conversations open and being like, like you say, like a real witness to the faith, hope, and love of, women and children and families, and doing the work and, promising, keeping our promises.
Thank you for reminding us of the virtues here. Let's talk a little bit. I want to get into some of the challenges, particularly with Ashley. Can we talk a little bit about hope right now? What gives you the most hope as we are at this historic moment? And Maureen, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Something I found really hopeful was earlier this week, there was a coalition webinar calling themselves Life Beyond Roe. And it was actually a 2-hour webinar, which I only got about halfway through watching the replay. But any of our viewers or listeners today, it's worth tuning into that. And it was sort of like 2 or 3 minute presentations from various people across the pro-life movement, across the country. And it was such a sign of hope to me because, I mean, there were many people from, the legal and political realm. There were many people who are in the, direct service providing sector. There are many people sort of in the PR and sort of particularly appealing to young people. I found hopeful, people like Lila Rose and Kristen Hawkins made a presentation, and they were short little presentations, but it was just sort of a glimpse of the breadth of the pro-life movement and how many people are out there working to build a culture of life. And, we're stuck in Washington here, and it's easy to have very sort of myopic inside the Beltway vision, but it was very, very hopeful to see the diversity and unity of the pro-life movement in this moment. So I found that very hopeful, and I would recommend it. It's again called Life Beyond Roe. And particularly the young people who were, speaking of young people, I'll take this opportunity also to mention one of my favorite young people on the pro-life scene is Alexandra DeSanctis. And I'm about halfway through her new book written with Ryan Anderson called Tearing Us Apart. And I've heard them speak about the book a couple times too. And this book is really hopeful. It's an excellent compilation of all of the pro-life arguments, many of which we've all heard before, but are sort of articulated in a new way with just real clarity and comprehensively. But in addition to that, there's a chapter particularly relying upon the work of Erica Bakayaki that Ashley was referring to earlier, speaking to why abortion is not good for women. And, why we are not defective men, and our life-giving capacity ought to be respected, and structures of society ought to be built to support women in our life-bearing capacity. So this book gives me hope. And, Alexandra is such a new, young voice on the pro-life scene. So anyway, those are some of the things that give me hope.
I just actually filed my review for the print edition of National Review of that book, so you can look out for that. And we did I did an event at Heritage with them the other day, which you can find on Heritage Foundation's YouTube channel. I also, on last Friday, I was at the Given Forum, which is a Catholic leadership event for young Catholic women. And I announced the news. They were encouraged to stay off their phones. So some of the room had no idea that Roe had been overturned. And it was something to be in a room of young women, all in their 20s, who cheered. Some of them sobbed in gratitude. And then we calmed down and we prayed and we talked about all the woundedness and all the healing that needs to happen. And it was really so encouraging. It wasn't a surprise to me, but it was just hopeful to see these girls get it. They get what's wrong with the culture. They get how people are hurting, and they want to do something better. Ashley, what gives you hope on all of this?
Yeah, I would say three things. One is what you're talking about just now, which is how female forward this moment is. I mean, just the fact that we're four women here talking about this. I loved watching the press conference for the House of Representatives where I'm pretty sure it was all women, and one of them right out front was Maya Flores, the woman, the pro-life Democrat who flipped the seat, and just had the courage to be a pro-life Democrat and get elected nevertheless. And she was right out there in front. And to me, she's kind of the future of the conservative movement, Hispanic, female, fearless woman. So that gives me hope. I would say the courage of so many people in the last 6 weeks. I mean, really our Supreme Court justices, one of whom had an attempt on his life. Another who it's not clear if he had to be taken into a safe place for a little while. The courage of the writing of the majority opinion. I love the way Justice Alito says, we have no idea. It's kind of ironic. It almost reminds me of, it's not ironic, but it reminds me of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, where he's like, we don't know how we'll be remembered. It's like one of the most memorable speeches ever. And Justice Alito said, we don't know what the reaction is going to be. And then he got a 6-week or 4-week taste of what the reaction was going to be. And it was not pretty. But they held the line and they didn't deviate, and they withstood serious headwinds. And then the courage of the people on the ground, as we've mentioned a couple times already, these pregnancy centers that are being threatened, defaced, attacked with demonic stuff.
Yeah.
The Jane's, is it Jane Ruth sent us? I mean, there's
And Jane's Revenge.
Dark arts feeling to that. It feels evil, like this idea that you were sent by the dead. Yikes. And one of our colleagues who couldn't be here today works in a pregnancy center, volunteering as a radiologist, doing the ultrasounds that they don't do in abortion clinics, just to help you. She said that, for the women or the people that she works with that aren't kind of in the thick of the political crossfire, that it was really scary for them to show up to work and have a death threat written on their walls. Like, they don't know, are they going to be, firebombed or shot or attacked? And so the fact that, none of these places closed their doors, I mean, maybe they've kind of kept their heads down for understandable reasons these last few weeks, but they certainly haven't stopped helping women. So and then lastly, I would just say actually kind of the calm. I mean, there was a lot of talk about night of rage, and I was in a major city the day that Roe v. Wade came down, and it was not, I know that there was definitely a lot of unrest, but I think overall the country handled this sort of quote unquote shockwave very well, and people are, I think, moving forward, and generally there's been more calm than not, which I think shows that we were ready for this moment as a country.
Well, and I think it's important for those of us who live in major cities on the East Coast, Ashley and Maureen and myself, that the extremes that we see aren't necessarily the majority of people who consider themselves pro-choice. In fact, it's not. And one of the things that gives me a lot of hope is that consistently polling has showed us over more than a decade that people who describe themselves as pro-choice, who identify as pro-choice, they want to know that women in difficult situations have options. And that's why I made the comment about who's really pro-choice. Obviously we're against abortion, but we want women to actually be able to choose life, which so often and increasingly in the rhetoric from abortion advocates, they want a right to a dead baby. And they want to pressure that. And even as you mentioned, corporations, it's not pro-woman to pay for abortion expenses. It's good for the business in the short term because they don't have to deal with maternity leave and all that comes with motherhood. Lee, can you talk a little bit about what gives you hope?
Yeah, it was nice after sort of, I feel like my first response was a little doomy, gloomy, and stressy. And I definitely feel all those things, but listening to my colleagues talk about all the, reminding me of the good stuff that we've seen in the last, week or so. It reminds me of that. I can't remember who put out this hashtag. I'm sure one of you knows the "We Were Born Ready" hashtag.
Yeah, the
really,
Los Angeles Archdiocese.
Yes, right, exactly. That really gets me fired up, and it makes me feel really like, yeah, we were born ready, and I just love the word born. And, I just think about, we've been waiting for this moment, and you can feel it. It's palpable, the excitement. You just have to stay out of, the comm boxes, not to get dragged down into the muck, because like Ashley and Maureen just pointed out, there's a lot of good that has happened this week.
There's tremendous peace that comes with living most of your life off social media. And I think people really needed to be reminded of that, especially at moments like this. Lee, can I have you talk a little bit? We saw during the Dobbs oral arguments, and we're seeing it again now, this lashing out at adoption. Even during the Amy Coney Barrett Senate hearings, confirmation hearings, the sense that she was some kind of colonist because she has children who are from Haiti. And so can you talk a little bit about this and how pernicious it is, and what a gift adoption is?
Sure. It reminded me when Maureen was first talking about some of these reactions being primal. And in the adoption world, there's a lot of talk about the primal wound, that because there's a truth, and no matter how much joy comes from it, there is a certain rescue element to all adoptions. There was some kind of lack, that caused this thing to happen. And a lot of people are really, really upset. A lot of adoptees, a lot of, birth mothers, a lot of adoptive mothers are speaking out against the ruling, because they're like, I have this kid who has, all these problems, and adoption is not the answer. And, I understand that comes from a place where, they're hurting or they're sad or whatever's happening. But actually, I think it was today, it could have been yesterday, a young woman, very talented young journalist named Nora Kenny, had a short piece in the Washington Examiner about this phenomena on TikTok, which is the social media thing that I have not got involved in. So I'm glad she wrote this, that in response to all these articles about how adoption's not the answer, and about how, knowing that your baby's out there in the world is worse than, having had an abortion, which I really don't get it. But there are kids who I think are either, adopted from foster care or had been in the system, were touched by the system in some way, and are angry that they're being used as an argument for abortion, and are like, and one of the best, a lot of them were a little profanity laced, because I'm very angry too, but so I won't do any direct quotes, but one of them was basically like, why would you you had your chance. Don't say my life's not worth living. I want my chance too. It might not look like what you think a good life is, but that's not for you to decide. And so apparently there's a lot of them, and they're taking it back, and they're saying, hey, we all know the foster care system needs a lot of help, a lot of work, more parents, more money, more everything. But, these kids are like, I'm glad I'm alive, no matter what I've seen and what I've been through. Don't tell me I'm better off not here. So I don't know. There's that part of it. I think the joys of adoption, I think, are really hard. Not every, people without children or people with children are called to adoption, just like every woman in a crisis pregnancy isn't going to be called to place her child for adoption. But, to those, to people who, I think young people, it needs to be part of pre-Cana, for one thing, for Catholic people anyway. And people need to start thinking about it, discerning it. Just like we all discern our vocations in our lives. Is this going to be something that's going to be a part of my life? Is it not? What can I do to help? I feel a little bit like a broken record here, but I'm always like, take the family with a new child, the casserole, because it's a lot of times they don't get that kind of love and that little bit of support. Take the time to learn appropriate adoption language. Use, that respects all of the people in the adoption triad. take the time to get to know families with adopted children, treat them like everyone else, but understand they might have challenges that you don't have, but we all have challenges that other people don't have. But man, I just can't say enough good things about adoption. And so if anyone ever has any questions out there in the metaverse, I don't know if that's the right word, just call me, email me, find me, and I will talk your ear off about adoption all day long.
And what's your Twitter tag? I forgot.
It's at Sneed Lee, capital S, capital L.
Okay. And gosh, there's so much to talk about. Ashley, so one of our challenges is, I'm so glad Lee talked about foster care. The foster care system is a mess, and it's a state by state kind of thing. And there's also the element of, I think, evangelicals, because they're one church, often know who the families are who are fostering or adopting. But in like a Catholic context, there's institutions. And so people don't necessarily, when they go to church on Sunday, look around and wonder who might not need a little extra love, Lee's husband, Carter Sneed, wrote I think it was in the Washington Post with Marianne Glendon yesterday about, this theme that we keep hitting on. The work is just beginning. And they talk about, the front lines and how we need to focus like a laser. And, individually, giving financial help, volunteering, if you have our financial means, think big. Like, is there a maternity home you could open? These are serious questions on the theme of radical hospitality, which I think is something that the gospel talks about. And I think about Dorothy Day in particular, who in the last century, she opened homes, the Catholic worker movement. And she in particular had an abortion that she regretted, an abortion before she became Christian, before she became Catholic. And I often think, she's not a canonized saint yet, maybe she will be. But that message of, she received God's mercy when she asked for his forgiveness for that abortion. And then she was so hospitable and generous and welcoming. And that's what we need to be at this moment. And Ashley, can you talk particularly about the policies we need to be thinking about that maybe we haven't to the extent that we should? We need to talk about parental leave, as you mentioned earlier. We need to talk about healthcare. There's so many in the weeds things that, sometimes I wonder if those who advocate for abortion do so because this is really hard work to figure out how to actually support moms and families.
Yeah, so, I think our work is twofold, cultural and legislative, and they work hand in hand. And I think that if there's ever a moment for bipartisanship, it would be now to coalesce around a paid family leave policy that is passable. And Democrats have been for decades trying to pass a top-down mandate that there's just not an appetite. We're not Europe. That's not how we do our laws. But I think there's been some incredibly creative proposals that have been put on the floor of Congress in the last few years that I'd love to see take off. I mean, these are modest proposals, but they're a start. For example, the Rubio plan that would allow new parents to basically draw early from their Social Security and take 3 months of what they would get in Social Security now, and then just extend the time that they pay it back. And to me, it's such a no-brainer because it's your own money that you're paying into the Social Security system. You're just having a little bit more control over when you're accessing it. And when a lot of people need it is much more when they're in their mid-20s and want to take a little time off to bond with their newborn, which we know from extensive science isn't actually pro-life thing we need to be pushing. The maternal, fetal, or newborn bonding science is very clear that it actually relates to or produces results in terms of the mortality rates and for the mental and physical health of the mother. So, that's one of a few different creative policies that have been put forward. And of course, they're means tested and targeted at, middle and lower income families. But, I do think that we need to listen to and acknowledge the exasperation that, and I've always thought that they're probably kind of related somehow, that we're like the only country in the developed world that doesn't have any kind of a federal paid leave policy. And we were also one of the only countries in the developed world with such extreme abortion laws. Like, there's middle grounds on both fronts, and hopefully the overturning of Roe will allow us on the abortion front to, start paving a much more moderate path as we work towards, the ultimate goal of a world with no abortion. But I do think that requires finding ways to legislatively meet the families that are struggling. When you have 1 in 10 women in this country who have any access to paid leave, and something like 20 to 30% of women going back to work like 10 days after they gave birth, we can do better. And, when you look at what we spend in this country, we can take let's start with taking the, $500 million we send to Planned Parenthood every year, and instead earmark that towards funding this, one of these programs, which the Rubio proposal wouldn't even require that. But, I think like the sky's the limit. Like, what about making donations to pregnancy resource centers not a tax deduction, but a tax credit? What about offering women? I know for many women, the struggle is having to balance the cost of childcare with student loan payments. And what about, legislation that, instead of wiping out everybody's student debt in this country, prioritizes the student debt, a delayed or a deferral or even some kind of a write-off for having kids. We've seen creative thinking like this in other parts of the world. I think Hungary is kind of the example. And, there's a big debate about, does it lead to an increased birth rate or not? But what we're talking about is the reality that there's going to be a lot more babies being born as a result of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And that means a lot more moms and dads who need, and I think are entitled to, being able to parent those babies in a way that's humane.
Yesterday, I was on a Zoom with Wisconsin Right to Life, and they were talking about a intergenerational housing unit that I think the college is called Mount Mary in Milwaukee, a Catholic college, and they converted one of their dorms into this. So you have single moms, pregnant moms, you have elderly people, and you have them interacting in a community like we should be living, right? Again, thinking creatively about using public funds better, and private initiatives, and we also have the layer of what kind of regulations and laws are going to be passed in some states where it's going to be harder to do that kind of faith-based work. So that's another level of this, layer of this, that we need to be cognizant of and to be on top of. Maureen, one of the questions in the chat box asks about something that is a huge reality. And I remind people who are listening live that you can put your questions in the chat box and I'll be weaving them into the conversation. Medical abortion by pill, chemical abortion. That's the majority of abortions in America now. And it will become increasingly so. And for people who do sidewalk counseling at abortion clinics, sidewalk counseling may become irrelevant because girls and women won't be going to abortion clinics. Now, at the moment, they still are, sometimes to get the pills, sometimes to have the surgical abortion. But how should we be thinking about that reality? And it's not really the future, it's happening now.
It's a huge challenge for the pro-life movement. It's probably our biggest challenge that we face in many respects. And I think it's going to sadly underscore the importance of supporting post-abortive women, because this is, as we see the explosion of abortion pills, which, can be ordered with a few clicks online. Just imagine a teenager by herself in the bathroom going through an abortion, often being able to see her embryo expelled, and the psychological damage, and often, obviously, there are great physical risks as well. But I think it kind of falls into the same categories of what Ashley was speaking about. So to kind of add to that, both the cultural and the political piece applied to, in the case of abortion pills too, because if on the cultural side, at least 3/4 of women say that they did not want to have an abortion. They just felt pressured into it, or they lacked the support. So what does that tell us? That tells us that probably the most important thing the pro-life movement can be doing is finding ways to support women through pregnancy care centers and maternity homes, promoting adoption, as Lee was talking about. But in order to do that, we really need to listen. And I think Ashley mentioned this too. And back to the virtues of faith, hope, and love. I mean, one of the best ways to love is to listen. So to listen to the real pain and the real circumstances, to find ways to best support women in these super difficult situations. And just to add to Ashley's comments on the political side, sort of the broader, more comprehensive, holistic approach, there's another new bill introduced by Senator Romney and Senator Daines, and Senator Daines chairs the pro-life caucus in the Senate. And it's another one of these kind of comprehensive bills to support family leave and other such policies. And I'll just add one other thing on listening from a strategic point of view, politically and legally. We really ought to listen to the messaging of the other side, because it has been surprising to me just how disciplined the other side has been in their messaging. And their messaging is November, 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 vote, vote, vote. So I just want to remind all of our listeners that we're 2 votes away in the Senate from the Senate being able to abolish the filibuster and pass the Women's Health Protection Act, which is even, beyond Roe versus Wade. So literally, it is really important, even though in a very real sense, the most important part of the pro-life work now is to get to the demand side, to be there to support women so they don't feel pressured into this choice. But in a very real way, we better keep up our efforts on the political and legislative front, because we're literally 2 votes away in the United States Senate from abolishing the victory that we just had with the Dobbs case.
I should add, because we've talked about the wounds and the need for healing, that there are a part of the pro-life movement is post-abortion healing. Project Rachel, Lumina post-abortion healing, the Sisters of Life, who are, if you know me, you've heard me talk about the Sisters of Life before, a community of women religious who are dedicated to God and take the usual vows nuns take: poverty, chastity, and obedience. But they also take a vow to protect the sanctity of human life, and they welcome women into their home. They meet them. Abortion-minded women will come to them, and the sisters will love on them, and eventually talk about the options. And it's remarkable how many times a woman comes to them, and because they feel loved, there doesn't need to be persuasion about being a mom. They want to be a mom. They know they're a mom, but they're too scared. And so many people in their lives and so many influences in their lives are telling them that abortion is what is expected. And that's really what 49 years of abortion in America has done. And that's why you see companies insisting that women have abortions, but pretend that they're doing something for women's rights and empowerment, and it's for her good. But of course, we know it's not. Lee, can you talk a little bit about, again, the challenges? How can we help women? So often, and Darcy Olson runs a group called Generation Justice in Arizona, and she herself is a single mom of 4 little ones, and she never intended on being a single mother, adoptive mother. She wanted to be a mentor to a teenage girl, and when she went into the child welfare office, there was some regulation where she couldn't actually, because of the way her house was, she couldn't, I think it was a loft, she couldn't take in a teenager, but she was told that there were babies down the hallway sleeping in offices that night, so if she wanted to take a baby, she could. And of course, once she knows this, she can't walk away. And one of the things that she talks about frequently and has been working legislatively on is, if you're pregnant and you're addicted to meth, this is not going to work. And she actually had a foster child who was with her, was placed back with the mother, and wound up dying because the mother just couldn't. And those are realities where, first of all, we have to tackle, addiction is part of the abortion conversation, because so many of those children who wind up in foster care, or hopefully they at least wind up in foster care and they don't wind up dead like this little baby was, are there because of addiction. And so there's so many issues we need to be talking about as we talk about a true culture of life. And the reality too, Naomi Schaefer Riley writes a lot about the foster care system. She has a book called No Way to Treat a Child. Mm-hmm. And she talks about how the child welfare world kind of insists on kinship care, and kinship care may not always be the best, approach. Obviously, you want to keep a child with his natural mother, her natural father, if that's possible, but sometimes that's not possible, and we need to be realistic about that. Can you just share some of your thoughts as someone who's in that world?
Yes, sure, absolutely. And I think, and this is something that our friend Elizabeth Kirk talks about a lot in her talks and writings about adoption. And it's something that she and her husband were a part of in Florida, was Respite Care. Mm-hmm. And that is, for me, it's the most immediate solution to keeping kids out of the foster care system, because once you're in, your statistics just plummet in terms of success, the way we sort of, judge things like graduating from high school, doing this, like not being addicted, not going to prison, all these things. Just because of the torment of being torn apart from your parents, reunited, maybe doesn't work again. Then you go to another family, and just that instability and all kinds of other problems. So the respite care, and that's another way for a lot of people to get involved. If you have the time, if you have the room in your house, you can provide support to a family in crisis who are at risk for losing their children to the foster care system. You can help them make it to their, parenting classes, if that's been some like court ordered and they don't have a car. Help them get to the job, help them get a job. Take their kid for the weekend, take their kid for a month so they can get it together and not lose their child. If, especially when they really do want to parent. Take them to AA or, another addiction program if that's the problem and they want to be sober. Just supporting these families before the child enters the system. Because for right now, like you say, reunification is beautiful and it's a great thing to work towards. It doesn't always work. The system is so overloaded with children and not enough families that they often sort of hope for the best with reunification, especially in those kind of addiction situations and something that's so highly addictive like meth. And it's just a completely dangerous situation for any child, especially a young baby. So those are sort of what I'm thinking. I mean, it's big, but the respite care is something. There's one organization called Safe Families.
Right.
That's one I can think of off the top of my head, but I know that there are others. And that's something that can be started, I think, at a parish, you know?
Right, exactly. The idea behind safe families, which is in some states, I know it's getting some opposition in other states because it's criticized as like a shadow foster care system. But in fact, what it is it's organizing churches to meet the needs. You know, if there are so many places of worship in the United States, and particularly there are so many Christian churches, there is no reason why there need to be all of these children in foster care. And if every church stepped up to the plate, we would not have the problem that we have today. And so this moment is really, particularly because advocates of abortion are really focusing in on, do you want to create a life and have them, you know, arrested at 18 and illiterate? We can do better than killing that child, right? All of us can step up to the plate in new ways. Ashley, if you could have a conversation with every person right now who considers themselves pro-life or is on the fence, and just give them marching orders, you know, what might they be?
Well, I would say the first thing to do is find your local pregnancy center and make a contribution. Probably the second thing I would say is, if you have the time and the bandwidth, to find one of these things we've discussed today and even just have the conversation with your own family about, like, could I volunteer? You know, like, if you're a doctor, could you, once a month volunteer at your crisis pregnancy center? Or, you know, if you're a family where your kids are getting older and you have the time, consider the option that, you know, Lee just discussed, where maybe you can do that. Or, so that would probably be my second thing. And then my third thing would probably be, look up what's going on in your state, get educated and get involved. And, you know, some states, they've already passed their respective trigger laws, but you know, the states that pass the really extreme trigger laws, that's an opportunity to get involved and educate people on, you know, if you're in New York, or Colorado, my home state, shame on them, you know, that you can have an abortion for any reason up until 9 months of pregnancy. So, like, it's interesting because my family in Colorado, they're a family of, there's like 10 registered independents. So whenever it's election season, the phone just rings for like 2 straight weeks. But, you know, they've become more dialed in to the abortion issue and are, you know, sort of appalled at how extreme things have been. And so, you know, I encourage them to vote on the amendment, which unfortunately passed to legalize abortion or failed. It was an attempt to curb the abortion law, but yeah, get educated about what's going on in your state and get involved, because a lot of these ballot initiatives that are going to be happening are probably going to be decided on thin margins, and this is the time. And also, as Maureen pointed out, you know, at the federal level, there's still a lot at stake. We're still in very turbulent waters, and we can't just check out and be like, cool, Roe v. Wade's overturned. Cool, I live in a state that's banned abortion after 15 weeks. No, you need to find out what's happening in your state and find out, you know, what kinds of things you know, what is on the ballot for you.
And as has been said before, politics obviously is important, but abortion isn't a political issue. It's a civil rights issue. And beyond the politics, we really have to have, as has been said before, substantive conversations that might be awkward. So many people have told me on Facebook, they've had people who never comment on politics be outraged about first the leak of the draft opinion and then the overturning of Roe. Maureen, you mentioned Tearing Us Apart, the book by Ryan Anderson and Alexandra DeSanctis. And I do think, you know, it's it's such a good and readable recap of where we are, where we've been and where we are. And I do think that people who are on the fence could take that book, it's written in a compassionate way, and have a conversation with people about an issue that they didn't think they could have a conversation with you about. And one of the things that I also think is really important, tomorrow morning I'll be going to our monthly Witness for Life in New York City, which increasingly it gets protested, and tomorrow we'll have police, as we tend to. I'm always cognizant of the fact that people in the neighborhood are thinking, this is Lower Manhattan, are thinking we're out there judging them when we're praying the rosary. No, I'm out there because we haven't done our job, as well as we could. We haven't communicated the truth about the human person as well as we could. And so we have to be really sensitive, not only to the hurt, but the misunderstandings. I was talking to a reporter last week who didn't believe that we have a network of women's care centers. There are a lot of secrets, best kept secrets here in the pro-life movement, and we have to work to not have them be secret anymore. And we have to also, one of the things I love about Pope Francis, which is a whole nother conversation, obviously there are things to scratch your head at and there are things to love, as with all human beings, but he repeats himself all the time, usually talking about mercy. And I think it's really important, even though we've been saying the same thing for our entire lives, in all of our cases, our entire adult lives at least, and maybe even a little younger, people will be hearing it for the first time. So don't get tired, I want to remind people we only have less than 10 minutes left, but if you had a question, put it in the chat box. And Lee, do you have a different perspective being in South Bend than all of us more hyper political, frenetic people on the East Coast?
I think it's possible to have it. Being married to who I am, it's hard, and still it does, even 17 years later, I feel like we just left DC. Right. So I read all the national newspapers and watch the news and, keep abreast of things. But there is a certain sense in which there aren't those extremes. You're friends with people who have, a wide spectrum of views. And they're so often, even if they fall on the pro-choice or the pro-life side, they're often very, very, very close. And it's capable, people are capable of having dinner parties with these people. And it's, you're not only with people who think like you and speak like you. And there's not, there's only so many of us here. And so there's a real community. And so, there's no one screaming at anyone else for the most part, which is nice, because you're going to have to see that person, at the grocery store. Right. So I think there's somehow that sort of small town civility. But again, there are lots of Catholics in town, and then there are non-Catholics. And certainly Notre Dame takes a lot of heat for a lot of issues. And but, that's been pretty, the only time I actually ever really saw anything nuts was when Obama was coming to give the commencement address. Then people really lost it across everyone, in town. And but no, it's pretty, people aren't really talking about it too much. I mean, obviously people talk about it on social media where everyone, across the globe is. But it is nice to be protected. Also, we have this is where the Women's Care Center started. There's fundraisers for it constantly. The local high schools do diaper drives for it. The number of adopted kids is so high that I always joke my 17-year-old was always surprised when one of his buddies wasn't adopted, because he's grown up with so many children that, families that were built on adoption, including, lots of, from domestic adoption, foster care adoption, international adoption. It's pretty commonplace here. So in that sense, there's there is a pretty thriving culture of life here in South Bend.
And Women's Care Centers is a network around the country that, as you say, started in South Bend. Mm-hmm. Maureen, you have a DC background. Your husband was a member of Congress. Do you have any advice on tackling this issue with people who don't agree with you?
Well, I mean, obviously, to approach the issue with love, which I think we all try to do, but listening, back to that point, I think it's really important to listen first to where people are coming from. And I was really edified earlier this week. Talk about cause for hope. There's a congresswoman from Iowa, and she's a young mother. Her name is Ashley Hinson. And she's in the Appropriations Committee, which is sort of at the hub of a lot of the abortion debates, because this is the committee in Congress that funds everything. So a pro-abortion congresswoman from Connecticut offered an amendment this week to give grants to reproductive health clinics because of potential threats of violence against them. A little bit odd to us who've been watching the pregnancy care centers under attack. But this congresswoman offered an amendment in the most gracious and civil way to also allow pregnancy care centers to, she was just so respectful in her manner speaking to this pro-abortion congresswoman. And I apologize if that's I don't know what sound that is. Sorry. I don't know where that's coming from. But she,
we're all used to that.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. I don't know what device that is. Maybe it's one of my kids. We were billed as Catholic moms, right?
Yeah. Yep.
But she offered this amendment to also allow pregnancy care centers to apply for grants at, through this amendment. So she added an amendment to the pro-abortion amendment. Mm-hmm. And I was shocked because it was unanimously adopted by voice vote. So all the pro-abortion members of the Appropriations Committee, and you have some real virulent pro-abortion people on that committee, they all voice voted this amendment on. And I think in part, it was because of Congresswoman Hinson's really compassionate and respectful presentation. So, I mean, I'm kind of shocked that this Congress just added an amendment to the labor HHS bill, giving grants to pregnancy care centers to help protect themselves. Now, maybe in the conference committee with the Senate bill, they're going to strip that out. I think we should keep an eye on that and keep a little pressure on. So I'm not saying it's a done deal, but it was very encouraging. And I think her manner and approach was very instructive.
It does sound like an example of you don't grandstand and you really actually want to bring people along with you. It may just be possible. And if people really care about women, they want women to have the choice to have their baby. I can't believe this, but we're about at an hour already. So I want to thank you, Maureen Ferguson, Ashley McGuire, Lee Sneed. You're all part of the Catholic Association, catholicassociation.org on the internet. And you can find their social media, different platforms there as well. There's also an email that goes out on weekdays, every weekday, with some news links that might be helpful. It's a nice news filter if you're specifically interested in kind of Catholic news, and pro-life is certainly part of that. And again, I'm Catherine Jean Lopez from the National Review Institute. So happy to be able to have co-sponsored this with you all at the Catholic Association. And please keep your eye on our work as well at the National Review Institute. On Wednesday, I'll be joining Lewis Brown from the Christ Medicus Foundation, and also in association with mycatholicdoctor.com and Her Plan, which is a new project of an offshoot of the Susan B. Anthony list to really focus on helping women on the front lines. And so that's on Wednesday. There's a link in the chat box, and you can email me at klopez@nationalreview.com if you want any further information, or if you want to be on my regular email list. And you can RSVP to the Wednesday event on pro-life healthcare there with the link in the chat box. With that, thank you everyone for your time. Please do feel free to share this. It's on the National Review YouTube page with friends and on social media. We want to bring more light than heat to this issue, because goodness knows there's enough heat and human misery. So we want to bring hope there. Thank you again, Ashley, Maureen, and Lee.
Thanks, Catherine.